Hello, everyone. This is Trip. And today, joining the Christianity in Process train is Jacob Erickson. And now Jake's been on the podcast a few times, always have tons of fun with him. But we've never had a conversation that was like intentionally around introducing process thought, his own experience and such with it. So, yeah, I mean, is this more intimidating than talking about ecological grief or what?
I suppose so. I mean, although they're always connected in my mind, but it's intimidating. I suppose it's one thing to record for a podcast, which is audio, but it's another thing to record with video when you're facing yourself.
Well, see, that says something about you. See, I have to avoid the temptation of just watching myself talk to you. Where I go, wow, Trip's talking. He's moving his hands.
Yeah, bit of a performance stage.
Yeah, well, that's why I have such a great set. Most people are like, how did you find such a rustic background with all the brick? And it's very bomb sheltery. And I'm like, yeah, my team, they came up with it. They came up with the aesthetic.
Amazing.
So I think a fun place to begin, I would love to hear your kind of theologian origin story. How did Jake, growing up in North Dakota space as Lutheran heritage and all those kinds of things, like how did all those questions lead to a place where you're like, you know what I want to do? Theologian.
Yeah. Well, I didn't start out wanting to be a theologian. I wanted to be to teach English literature because I always had a love of reading and poetry, and that was one of the ways that I kind of escaped as a kid. I guess the easiest way to tell it is that I grew up with a really large family on the farm, Western North Dakota, and my mother's side were all sort of mainline Lutheran, pietist, warm, fuzzy, Jesus heart people. Every time I grew up with my great grandmother being really close, and she was like, every time you were with her and left her, she would say, she'd grab your hands and she'd say, look to the Lord, Jacob, look to the Lord, kind of thing. And so church in that way, in that Lutheran way, was always a really present part of my life. And then my father's side of the family, we're all, I think you could say there's a kind of a political intellectual streak. A little bit of my grandfather was a huge part of that in my life. He was a politician, a state senator, chair of the North Dakota Democratic Party at one point, but always very like tricksterish with religion. And with him and spending time with him and leaving him, he'd always say, well, Jacob, don't you think, isn't religion just really incredibly violent? Don't you think there's problematic things about it? And yet he'd be going to church as well. But he was always sort of subversive with religious language and literature. So I had these two sort of really important figures. One was kind of contemplative, spiritual, pietist. One was deeply political, activist, and questioning. And I think the best thing is for me was that those were significant relations into making me. And I'd say I'm both of those in practice and in my orientation. And they drove a lot of questions, but I didn't think of myself as a theologian. I didn't know that theologian was a calling, a vocation, a kind of work. And my family is mostly teachers and mostly farmers. And so teaching was kind of like out of the two options. I was leaning towards teaching all the time because I was always reading, always had that kind of intellectual side for me. Through high school, focused on English lit, and then got to college and went to St. Olaf College and had to take a required introductory religion class. And it was with Professor Dean Lagerquist at St. Olaf. And it was an 8 a.m., if I'm remembering right, and got in there. And it was on, it's sort of introducing approaches to the Bible through the theme of relationship. So the family and friends of God. So reading all these amazing texts on feminist approaches to the Bible and some queer approaches, and thinking through both historical and contemporary criticism. And for an 8 a.m. class that was filling a requirement, I fell in love with the conversation and fell in love with it felt like my head was catching up to my heart a little bit in that space, that these kinds of things that I'd taken for granted as being sort of central values to my life. I didn't know there was a whole academic stream of thought that integrated the kind of activist, critical, questioning methods that I had seen modeled by family members. And it became clear to me that that's something that I wanted to do. So I ended up majoring in English and religion together. Never lost the poetry side of it, which is partially, I think, what flows into the process, theological interests as well, and minored in historical perspectives in religion and violence, which was a made-up minor that I was allowed to put together, looking at different periods of history, the American Revolution, the Crusades, and different ethics modules, classes, kind of thinking through ethical approaches to religion and violence. Because that's, I think, my grandfather's questioning always pushed to me this piece of, the relationship of religion and violence. And is religion intrinsically violent? How does religion respond to violence? How does Christian theology in particular think about violence and power? Questioning all of political moments. So I think all those streams kind of flow into it. That's as an origin story.
So when you decided to do your, I don't know what you'd call it, create your own minor in the history of religion and violence, and it comes out of this question that is part of your kind of family's legacy of connecting kind of intellectual inquiry, your Lutheran background, activism, and engaged in politics. How did that exploration help you parse those different elements? Because most people, if they think religion and politics and Lutheran theological tradition, have a very clear answer on how this works, and yet I guess it's been problematized enough up to this point. So was there, when you think through like the legacy and questions of your family and then getting to religion and violence, like what were the possible viable options when you got done taking a question like that seriously as a young scholar?
The question lodged itself as this question of the Lutheran theology of the cross as a tradition was always really important to me. That sort of attention to suffering places, avoiding certain kinds of theologies of glory. And a lot of Lutheran theologians in history can tend to take that in very pietist ways, that you actually just, you're not meant to be very prideful. You're supposed to be really humble. But politically, for me, in an era where the rise of right-wing evangelicalism was so present, in a context where political and culture wars were sort of very present to me in college and in high school, I couldn't understand how Christians who take the cross seriously as a site of an expression of God's power, however you take that in all of its contradictory ways, at that point, I couldn't understand how Christians could throw themselves into this sort of very strict theology of glory that was more about policing values and policing political arenas and exclusions of people. It just didn't make sense to me that the way that Christianity was sort of getting dominant voice was in this glorification of a certain kind of violent power, when everything in my Lutheran tradition had always pointed towards a kind of theology of the cross. And I think North American Lutheran traditions do a pretty good job of saying, like, in internal conversations, there's a lot of problems there as well, but internal conversations and saying, like, that progressivist theology of power that's strong in evangelical and conservative religious circles is not Lutheran. We don't do prosperity gospel. But that also meant to me, like, what does it look like? What does God's power look like in the present? And so I kind of weaved my way through reading a lot of theologies of the cross. I took a summer during college and read Moltmann on my own. Just sort of like interning in a church and sitting in the corner in the office, reading The Church and the Power of the Spirit and The Crucified God. And
that sounds like fun to me. I mean,
it was absolutely brilliant. I was running vacation Bible school with a bunch of folks during the day, and then at night sneaking away for like a nice evening read of.
Hi, kids. Today we're going to talk about the crucified God.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got some really cool flannel characters now.
Yeah, exactly. So it was that and Tillich, I think, because I mean, like, where do the Lutherans go? They go to Tillich, and so the and Tillich and Moltmann, and so that expansive sense of thinking about the cross and thinking about religious language in different ways, not just as a philosophical exercise. Because I think a lot of folks will read Tillich, especially, and say, this is just existential, experiential language, and it's really abstract theologically, and which is also a critique that gets railed against Whitehead, that this is sort of an speculative system and it's really philosophical, and what does this have to do with the real life of faith? But for me at that point, I was like, the explorations of these kinds of theological languages are precisely a critique of this sort of over literalist theology of power. Like, it takes seriously the fragments of experience that confront us, the senses of the ways that power destroys life, and where one might begin to look in history and present and in one's own active faith for how one embodies that kind of integration of spirituality and social witness. So that language was really always really political to me, even though it's usually billed as philosophical theology, and Tillich is political too. But.
Oh yeah. Okay. And so here's something that came to mind, like thinking, we're about the same age. And at this point in time is when, if you are a Christian, that attachment to Jesus means you probably aren't a priori committed to imperialist wars, right? Then like being in college, 9/11, and the religious aftermath. I remember that, to me, was the question similar around the religion and violence that made me problematize, like, and look at people, right, who I was like, you told me to read my Bible and pray and Jesus is the answer. And then 9/11 happens and you're like, there's weapons of mass destruction, kill the Muslims. And you're like, whoa, I thought we were working from this playbook. And I remember just being utterly embarrassed, and it made no sense to me how you have the biggest protests at that point in history all across. We're like, don't go in, don't invade. And we lie, fabricate things, go in and do what we want. And it was in that context where critiquing visions of omnipotence in class, a professor told me, look, Tripp, this sounds like process philosophy. It's not compatible with Christianity. So I go to the library, as a nerd does, and look it up, Process and Power, read Hartshorne's Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, and John Cobb's God in the World over the weekend, come back in ready to roll, And I just remember following that, going to those passages at the end of Process and Reality where Whitehead's going like, look, there's a whole host of big pictures of God in the West. You got the ruler. You got a nice, good old king. Definitely a dude. You got moral, law, judge, and you got being.
Yeah.
And then there's another one. It's a Galilean vision. And it doesn't seek to control. And he starts giving this beautiful picture where I go, yeah. So the actual picture of power in the cross, that God's power is cross bearing, not cross building. God's power is bottom up, not top down. God seeks liberation, not domination. Like all these things, it just seemed really obvious to me as a Baptist preacher's kid that read the Bible. Then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, this philosophical nerdiness actually helps me understand the experience I've had as a follower of Jesus and want to make sense of the world. And so, like, when you said that, I thought, ooh, the religion violence thing, the philosophical stuff actually being helpful. The real setup was like, how did that whole background of our generation, in a sense, coming to grips with the failure of religious and political institutions and the divine justification in the back of it. Like, how did you handle that?
I mean, you handle it at that point as well as anybody else can, right? Like 9/11 and the responses to that were the end of high school, and the invasion of Iraq was my first year of college. And I think, how did I handle it? I didn't handle it alone, in that I had, just given where I was going to college at that point, lucky enough, there was a number of folks who were showing examples of what forms of prophetic Christianity looked like. And the giving permission to interrogate, teaching as an inquisitive act that doesn't close political horizons. And it wasn't just the violence of that imperialistic moment either. It was also the emergence of crises and sex scandals, as well as for me in up until 2009 in the ELCA and the Lutheran Church, conversations about human sexuality and ordination and marriage for same-sex folks. So I feel like it's the political culture war was always present, but also the personal one as well, which is also political. And I think being able to be in theological spaces and theological communities that were always tilting progressive, and also being with each other in the questioning and in the ongoing kind of mode of accompaniment, because the risks of the solidarity of love in those spaces are very Christic, right? They're real risks. They're risks to well-being. They're risks to political exclusion. They're risks to certain kinds of community. And so I think, I mean, I would say I didn't get through it alone. And I think there's not one single political thing that was probably the driving force. I think it was just this barrage of stuff all at once, which made it really exhausting, right? Like it was really, and I think it was really hard for progressive theologians and Christians to really articulate a clear and confident vision, because we were being embattled so much by the kind of cultural attack on, or the cultural valorization of power and morality policing. So it always felt really responsive, even as we're trying to create spaces of vulnerability and conversation. And I think perhaps maybe from college to grad school, I'm wanting to find places to articulate that clear vision. I got glimpses of that in college, and I wanted to embody that in even stronger ways. I didn't encounter process theology until later. I got one lecture on it in my second year of college. Charles Wilson, who's one of the best teaching theologians out there, he said, we were doing a history of modern Christian thought, and he said, all right, today we're going to do process theology because you need to know what this is. And he gave this whirlwind lecture, and I remember it very vividly, and the questions of power and desire, and seeing John Cobb's name up on the board for the first time. And it stuck with me, but the lines of it didn't really begin to sort of come together until actually doing process theology in some more serious ways later on.
So one of the questions, like when people joined the class, they had the option of sending in a burning question. And there are a couple around the topic of like how process thought helps you think through your sexuality. But one of them, Jerry, said they're a freshman in college. They're taking the class because they're trying to figure out how to understand their own fluctuating sexual orientation and a religious past that didn't let them ask the question. And so I wonder if from your own experience and being a professor that works with students that are, when you ask God questions, sex questions are right on the other side so often. And you hinted at the relationship of desire and power. How do you have wisdom on how to help, how to take the time to think through and process something like that?
Oh, I mean, there's no one direct way of answering that question. What I found with process thought to be incredibly helpful is that it's multiscalar in some ways, that you see traditions in process just as much as you see individuals in process. And so being authentic to discerning that kind of ongoing conversation and relational unfolding with oneself, I think that becomingness of sexuality and of one's own sexuality and desire in relationship to the institutional power context that we're in, a sense of embodiment of that. And I always like that. I think process thought was really helpful for me because it always simultaneously articulated God working through desire as that sort of persuasive love, and simultaneously was always committed to the sense that is an ecological vision. Those two things together, that creative responsive love and that ecological vision that Cobb articulated, because that allowed me to say as a queer person that there's something about the contemplation of and discerning of desire and trajectory that is deeply holy, and that happens in the flux of my own body, which is not always something that is said in Christian theological traditions. It's usually said, oh, what is human nature? And behold, here's sinful human nature. And I was like, I being queer was never something I needed forgiveness for. Maybe I need forgiveness for other things, or maybe need discernment for other things, but that was never one of them. And so I think that sense that the process world is always about the indeterminacy of bodies, and that discerning desire in bodies is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It allows me to say too that God is queer, right? That God's responsive love is in itself a kind of indeterminate responsive love that is oriented with certain values. So there's that sense in which it's not just affirming, not to be evangelical for process thought on this point, but it's not just affirming of queer human embodiment in my mind, or at least potential for that. It's also affirming of the fact that has deep theological implications as well. Not for a static omni cis hetero God.
Yeah. A lot of, and I'm guessing from the way Jerry put the question, a lot of people that grow up in a more evangelical context, the impact of purity culture, and the kind of focus on an individual and sexuality with these kind of eternal norming expectations really creates a space where the moment you think or have a desire or contemplate being anywhere else but on the right side of a binary, then the anxiety that comes up, even if you don't believe it, is like, if I even test the waters, am I now on the other side of the space where God shows up? And I think one of the things that in what you were saying that stuck, like if you're thinking of how to receive the invitation you gave in a pastoral way, is a part of the process vision is recognizing like everything of who you are that's showing up in this moment is the very place the grace of God comes and invites you into whatever is like good, true, beautiful, adventurous, zesty. And then wherever you manage it, the next moment, it all shows up again. And the process vision of God is the one that affirms the totality of your past, the parts you know and the parts you don't, and the parts you love and the parts you don't. And that's the very place like the invitation comes. And I think that the way you put it, it's like I felt this resonance of where you're like taking the process vision and that like Lutheran affirmation of our identity as the beloved of God. And you were like weaving them together and going like, don't you want some processed queerness? Because it just is that zesty. That anyway, that's what was going through my head when you were sharing that.
No, that's really helpful, because I think it is really important to me that, I mean, that's the Lutheran grace affirmation. That's you are accepted. But that acceptance and that affirmation is in itself because God desires in us and of us and to us and for us. And that is an affirmation. I think it's really important to articulate it as a relational vision, because one of the problems that I see, and purity culture was, I remember there being like a True Love Waits rally in high school, and I looked at the cards and stuff, and I was like, what is this? But like, one of the problems with it is that it hyper conditions folks to imagine their sexuality in an individualistic and isolated context. And that becomes problematic for the oppression of LGBTQ folks, but it also becomes problematic for the sense that human sexuality and desire and sexual relationship are fabrics of communal dimension, relationality, reciprocity, justice. And so hyper attention on purity culture begins to hide and oppress forms of communities of sexual justice, communities that articulate and listen to one another, communities that are name sexual violences and caricatures, communities that it sort of feeds into the oppression of reproductive justice and reproductive rights as well. And so I think that language of purity culture does more caustic damage because it destroys community and destroys just community at its core, and makes people not only forget those dimensions of it, but makes them feel alone. And I don't want that.
I mean, I don't know a lot of people that do want it. It's not the number of people who start to voice the impact, right, of purity culture on them. And they are like, am I the only one thinking this? And then you realize, I personally, as someone that thought everyone in their accountability group did keep all the rules, I was real disappointed to find out I was the only successful person. I was like, come on, we were an accountability group. Don't you think you should have told me if you were backsliding and licentious living with your fiance? No, it didn't happen.
I lucked out there because my parents were always affirming of human sexuality, even as I would sort of come out to them later. And in general, like, sexuality wasn't a bad thing. And in confirmation class for my Lutheran church, I remember, like, sex is a beautiful thing. Here are what its implications. And not to collapse sex and desire, right? We can't do that because desire functions in a whole numbers of ways. But there was always this stream of religious affirmation of the beauty of human sexuality, even in the context of a lot of, and frequently it was cisgendered heterosexual sexuality, sex. But I think that affirmation was a rare thing in my context for folks, but it made a huge difference when it came to thinking about sexuality and desire in larger contexts of LGBTQ plus contexts, and then also in terms of broader communal conversation as well, desire, metaphysics, even. Mm-hmm. So that's something I take as a gift from my past that leads into different futures that I wouldn't have known at that point.
No, that's awesome. It reminds me of this. The first time I saw Marjorie Suchocki lecture and was in undergrad, there was some question around, she did this intro to process thought thing. I went to the Summer Process Institute in Claremont, and there's some question about, like, what does it really mean when a process theologian's talking about God receiving the world and the world receiving God and this divine reciprocity? And Marjorie goes, well, it means that after a quality orgasm, you tell God you're welcome. And I was like sitting there, like taking notes, like, get an orgasm, tell God you're And like you look around and all the process, like, true believers in the room were like, yep. And I'm like, I don't think I've tried that before. Bring it up. Alicia, you wouldn't believe what Marjorie said. She's like, didn't pray silently, but I do think that underneath that is that vision. You mentioned embodiedness, the way desire functions. A lot of it is the way in which process thought brings eros into the divine in a thick sense. For people, it might be new to picturing the God-world relationship that's going on in process. How does a philosophical picture help make sense of of reflections around desire, embodiment, and thinking about the whole web of relations in life?
There's a few different ways you could go about it. I mean, one would be simply to say that our lives and living are always risky and vulnerable in our embodiedness, and human sexuality and desire has a certain kind of risk to it, and a certain kind of newness. Always the sort of like stepping out, being lured to something new, trying something new, encountering a different relationship that embodies something new. I mean, there's all that kind of excitement about it, and to be lured into just ways of encountering that risk and newness is I think something that process potentially offers. Risk is part of it to me. I've been thinking a lot about risk because of the ways that we stand in solidarity with the planet, thinking about the ways we stand in solidarity with broader intersectional coalitions and the kind of risk taking that takes on. And there's always this back and forth of, do you take care of yourself, or do you, risk forms of solidarity? And I think that saying that risking solidarity when it's possible and just and good is about desire is a really, really helpful thing for me. That I'm desiring this solidarity, that this solidarity is desiring me, and that desire can transform some new forms of intimacy and relationality in ways that I'm not fully aware of. So that's a political example, but I think that flows into the intimacies of human sexuality, of relationships, of the plurality of the ways that relationships happen, or sexual encounters happen, and that those relationalities are always unfolding. They're never quite fixed. Partners and families and kin connections don't all look similar, and they're always unfolding in those forms of networks. And to say that God is sort of luring those forward is to not simply say that all of these relational networks are completely chaotic. They are queer, and that queerness means forming bonds of creative, responsive love in those forms. There's a responsibility in that chaotic queerness, I think, that is about sexual justice and power and theological justice, and it's a response to the divine. I think, right, that responding to those earthly trajectories is responding to God, rather than simply saying that we need to transcend them or something like that. In throwing ourselves into those just relationalities is divine response from ourselves, and offers some new possibilities there. That's kind of the quote with when Whitehead talks about God being the poet of the world. Yeah. That's kind of what I imagine, is that poet of the world is like all of these different forms of human sexuality and identity and relational connection and community constantly unfolding in just kingdom ways. And that's a poem to me. That's incredible. And it's a poem in the sense that it's ongoing in its creativity. There's not an idyllic family unit out there that God wants. God wants just relationships, and those look very different. Just relationalities all the way down the line. So I don't know if that's exactly responding to the way that you phrased the question, but
well, you when you bring out how the category risk helps you think through desire and solidarity, and I wonder if those categories aren't also the kinds of things you were hinting at earlier when you talked about the challenge of the cross. And then what does it look like for Christians to confess that what Jesus said, did, endured is revealing of the divine?
Yeah. I mean, there's the risk. Love always entails a risk of loss, I think. And we have to be careful there, right? We can't simply say that, like many really important criticisms of any theology of the cross have said, that the cross is not about that you are to throw yourself into enduring suffering or to intend to go about suffering. It's about paying attention to, infused with process thought, to me at least, it's about attention to those spaces where the risk of the intensity of life might bring about newness and justice and beauty. And I think that's very right. Like not Jesus, take this cup from me, right? I'm throwing myself into the solidarity of love. And that's not a sort of a foretelling, I think, of what he was like, oh, I'm going to go to the cross now. I mean, he kind of knew that was the ultimate sort of trajectory of it, but that's not his intention. His intention is just relationality and protest in those spaces. So I think there's a more nuanced theology of the cross potentially that the process vision allows, for me at least, that it's about paying attention to those minute spaces where we're being lured forward and asking what's the potential here, rather than saying, where can I go to throw myself onto the gristmill of history? What is the potential here? And how am I being lured forward in it? Because if anything, the cross represents an ultimate closure of a future in some ways. And so sometimes things end, but Jesus was always looking for the possibilities and subversions in that.
One of the topics that came up in a number of questions that came in were how does a process vision help you understand scripture differently? How do you understand its authority, inspiration, and reading it? And you having been part of what animated your own faith was literature, right? And the Lutheran tradition, very big on scripture. So yes. Take us through how you understand things like inspiration, authority, and then the task of reading scripture in the present.
There's a subtle critique that Luther makes that I find really, really helpful for a starting point. And that, just as much as we talk about the Bible as the word of God, the Bible isn't the word of God. Christ is in that space. And for traditional Lutheran theologies, and Luther talks about the Bible as the wood of the manger bearing the Christ child towards us. And I think that's a helpful mode. It's a text, or as Deanne Lagerquist said in that 8 a.m. class that I first took, it's a book of faith for faithful people. It's not a guidebook or a sort of literal manual. It's something where it's a landscape where we encounter things. And so the words of biblical stories don't always mean anything for me. Like there are spaces that I read that I'm like, there's nothing here for me. And there's nothing here for me today. That doesn't mean that there won't be something there for me in the future, or that a text that's been meaningful for me in the past won't become meaningless to me in the future. I find that the Lutheran theological emphasis was that what preaches Christ, what preaches the sort of law and gospel, or the sense of grace in that. And sometimes those passages in a particular time and space in preaching don't preach Christ. And paying attention to where that's happening is really important. But I think what process gives me a little bit is that I'm constantly, because of my changing embodied circumstance and because of the different ways that I'm being lured forward in that embodied circumstance by the divine, that I see different passages at different times with different meanings for different futures. And so the Bible is really important to me. I mean, I'm one of those folks who still reads the Bible every day. And some days I get nothing out of it. And some days I see a phrase or a whole story that means a heck of a lot for how I'm considering it. It's literature for me, but also I do take the historical critical piece is really important for me. Let me put it in a condensed way. Holmes Rolston has a really lovely little text on the Bible and ecology, where he talks about how the ancient peoples who wrote or spoke biblical texts that would eventually become our biblical texts, may not know the way that the universe goes the way that we do, but they knew their living and their relationships at a close range and at a just one, potentially, and thinking through how to be responsive to the divine in their contexts, in their circumstances, and with meaning and certain values of love and justice and mercy. And so in a historical way, I can look back at those historical critical texts and say like, yeah, these are people who, just like me, were wrestling with very similar kinds of existential questions, but also potentially in a different cross-cultural context. I can read the text abstracted from that and say, sometimes I get a sense of meaning out of the poetry. But I also think it's really important to say that because they're ancient texts, because they're in a different context, and because they have different expectations, we have to be willing to jettison the text when it doesn't work. And that doesn't mean jettisoning the text when you disagree with it or when you find it problematic willy-nilly. It means reading the Bible with certain senses of values of just relationship, and saying this text is really problematic for us in this moment. You wouldn't read certain passages to someone in a moment of pastoral care because that would be an act of violence. Some of the images of war and colonialism have been critiqued in various ways. And yet the conversation about those critiques is precisely in conversation with these biblical texts. So it's an ongoing conversation for me. The authority ultimately is the Spirit as it works through that particular text. And there's a bit of confidence that that's a really important thing that space is. What that says to me also is that the Bible is not the exclusive mode of communication from God, but it is a promised one. And so Luther says, like the Bible bears the Christ child to us, but he also says, I might find Christ dwelling in earth and fire and water. But given the chaos of life, I might not always sense that or perceive that there. So he just kind of says, the divine dwells in creation, is communicated through the word, but it's a lot of it's about paying attention and discerning, and not as a human work, but as a flow of divine love.
Yeah. When you give the description of the role of the Spirit, right, and reading the text, so like one of the things in what you said is like habits of continually engaging it, and then wrestling with it. And sometimes you set it aside, but last time it spoke to you. The way you relate to Scripture is a conversational one that the Spirit of God inhabits. And a lot of times, I think people, the way you envision biblical authority and the function of the text kind of sidesteps the way the text can function to invite the Spirit's presence in the act of reading. And that depiction is also similar to a lot of your work in relationship to creation and nature. Yeah. And I'd love for you to describe that, because I mean, if you think of how you just described scripture, and then you were part of like the project I've been a part of, like the Book of Nature project, you could imagine, right? Like wanting to invite us to make those same observations. Like, what parts of this text have been silenced? How have you, assumed these kinds of interpretive tools and how it functions? And in doing so, you've deadened something that should be alive. Like, there are all these things. I saw these connections between the two.
Yeah.
You go, let's give Jake the softball.
Yeah. That's a great example, because, sometimes in my work, like, people will talk about, oh, what do you think about the creation story? And they mean the Genesis one in the beginning, or when God was beginning. And as someone who loves reading biblical texts, I have to come back and say, which creation story do you mean? Because there's so many different ones happening in biblical texts at different times. And I find that certain ones are more helpful in certain contexts than others. But I also find I tend to dwell more in wisdom literature frequently than some of the more pyrotechnical creation. I like the everydayness of Kohelet, and a bit of pessimism there. But I think, like, thinking about creation in different ways from biblical imaginaries. One of the ways that the Bible can function in that is that it can open up our senses of creation to multiple modes of creativity of the earth in different ways of attention. I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it. But the role of the Spirit in real lived ecological spaces, I think, is really important, because as Christians tend to look to, and well, however this actually looks on the ground, I think you'd have to do a Pew survey, but I think Christians tend to say, well, whatever is happening in the earth is happening in the earth, and where do you want to go and hear from God? I go and read my Bible, and it's in the text, and the rest of the world can do its own thing. Sort of the more conservative view of that, it's, the Bible tells us to have dominion. We should do that on one hand. And then there's the more dismissive view of, spiritual people, they just like to see God in the sunsets, and that's just a load of bull, and that's not real Christianity. And I think they're both wrong. Like that there's something deeply important about integrating a sense of spiritual vision, contemplation, and practice in all of these elements, recognizing that the Bible is produced in our lived and embodied experiences. It affects our lived and embodied experience of perception of the world, and our lived and embodied experience in and as earth affects the way that we read the Bible, but also the ways that we live in our earthly contexts. Is our spiritual practice, our theology, our religious community helping us to pay attention to the way that the divine dwells in traditional language, in, with, and under the elements of the world, or in more process words, in the way that the God is panentheistically wrapped in throughout the whole fabric of the universe, because the divine is that open, infinite, unfolding, interacting, present, moving. And like I was saying earlier, that the way that the Spirit in queer life is sort of helps us to see that our embodied life is a kind of divine thing, so too do our ecological interactions tell us that there's an element of divinity to our ecological interactions all the way down. And that attention to the divine is attention to seeing the divine's attention in the world and indwelling in the world. So it goes both ways as we flow and respond. Maybe to go back a little bit and say it a little bit like this, that I think one of the reasons why risk is helpful in human sexuality stuff, but also in terms of ecological stuff, is that I think one of the things that we're being lured to right now is to pay attention to the complications and tragedies of extinctions in the climate, and to pay attention to those things in our bodies, in our ecologies, impacts our sense of vulnerability in the world. To become more aware of wounded places, of wounded creatures, of lost creatures, can potentially be emotionally overwhelming for folks. And yet, I think it's a more dangerous thing to act as if those things aren't happening. It commits more violence. And so the risk of being lured into our ecological embodiment is to see those vulnerabilities, to see those losses, to see those unravelings of relationality in cascade effects and extinction. Just to pay attention to those is an ecological and divine thing. It's a hard thing, but it's divine to me. Like, it's divine work.
Do you think that, like, in some sense, one of the larger kind of pushbacks process tradition gives to at least a lot of dominant theologies in Western Christianity is it insists that I know everything's always already entangled in relations. And so it's not that it is or isn't, right? Like, you know, and it's not just us, it's also with God. And part of the way violence is preserved in relations are when our institutions, our traditions, and our language cut ourselves off from even acknowledging those relations. And so think of just in lockdown, how many people had white Americans had not taken the legacy of white supremacy and its use of state violence towards black bodies seriously. Right. And then they did. And it wasn't like that wasn't the case before. It's like once you start to dwell on this and you realize the violence that is being preserved by us believing that we're individuals cut off and only choose to relate, that picture of relationality is like intense. And so one of the things I'd love to hear you kind of lay out is how opening ourselves up to acknowledging those relations. What do we do then when with affect, with grief, with pain, with injustice, and all, especially in places where we start to experience it and we don't have the power or agency to ultimately change it? I think the fear of feeling it without the agency to change it is one of the most powerful tools our current domination system uses to keep us cut off. That
climate change is too big of a problem to even begin to do anything about. I actually think that practically the first step, and it's one thing that I really appreciate about process thought too, I think, in the way that I read our attention to desire and bodies is actually this commitment that you actually have to be contemplatively and justly listening first and foremost to what's actually going on, listening or paying attention or what have you. Because one thing that I find is that, especially for folks in privilege and power, when they find out about a social injustice or suddenly are convicted by it, there's this sort of knee-jerk desire among social justice kinds of tourists to say, like, oh, I'm going to go and fix this now, without actually listening to any of the folks who've been doing that justice work or thinking about the complex violence manifesting in our domination systems in the present. And I see this a lot with like climate change, like the urgency of climate change suddenly convicts someone. And they say, oh, I'm going to read about this a little bit, but then I'm going to start proposing solutions right and left without listening to global folks, indigenous folks, climate justice folks who've been doing this work for decades. And so the listening to the universe is about both paying attention to what's happening and being convicted by it, but also about paying attention to where just relationality is being articulated and where it can be lifted up first. So that listening becomes, for me, the primary act of agency, or to quote Nell Morton, right? Like, one of the best things we can do for one another is hear one another to speech. I use that as an ethical conviction for everything that I do. And I think that's very important in the process way of seeing and being in the world. But then there's this question of agency, of moral agency, of being overwhelmed. And so if listening is the first act, perhaps, then very closely second is a sense that we don't have a clear redemption story here. And that's about being real about our relationality in the world. That there's vulnerability, the reality of violence, and acting like we can simply heal those into a kind of wholeness that is sort of unaffected by the past, heroically, sovereignly, is frequently trying to perform a certain kind of vision, like the American dream, that was hiding those violences in the first place. So learning to sit with those vulnerabilities and violences is a second. And then third is that sense of agency, where agency is, I think for me, when you recognize that the world is relational all the way down, you recognize firstly that you're not alone in it, that one of the lies about the fact that, we can't do anything about climate change, or we can't do anything about systemic racism, or we can't do anything about X, Y, and Z. This is just baked into the fabric of history now, or it's inevitable. One very frequently intimately tied to that is the sense that if anything were to be fixed, it had to be done by an individual, and it had to be done into a kind of wholeness, perfection. And process tells me, no, that's not the case. We're relational all the way down. That means I'm entangled with other folks who care about this issue just as much as I do. And how do I connect with them? How do I listen to them? How do I ally with them in forms of solidarity to offer the best response that we possibly can to this problem in the present and in the moment? We don't respond as individuals. We do in some ways, but if we're responding on an environmental issue, wasted fresh water accounts for less than 10% of individual use. The rest is agricultural systems and political systems and infrastructures. And so if you want to make an ecological change, you have to pay attention to those networks of relationships in the first place. So it's about recognizing that relationality might empower us. It might also make us take the depths of the problem more seriously, ultimately. And it gives us permission to say the ultimate fix may not be present. And in fact, there may be failure involved. That's part of the risk of it. But we can respond the best that we can, knowing what we know and knowing that there are others responding with us. That's really freeing to me, because it means it's not all up to me. I don't have to save the planet. I don't have, my reducing, reusing, and recycling is not going to create some sort of salvation narrative. But if I'm listening to climate activists, and if I'm connecting, finding community, engaging in political action, calling political representatives, even though we don't feel that they may listen to us at all, I've got all of my government officials on my speed dial, and I call them a lot, and I write a lot. And I really think that those things make a difference, even as the challenge of the moment requires so much more of us to connect and form creative senses of community. If we're going to respond to any of the sort of anti-ecological, ecocidal, anti-queer, anti-trans, anti-human, anti-woman, anti-anything, we have to do it together, and we have to do it in an integrated whole, because they're all interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
So
I really like the way you laid out all 3 points. And something I hadn't asked you that I've been wanting to ask you, what it made me think of, is how do you process think through how do you process how the globe responded to, say, COVID, right? Just in what we stopped doing and reorganized our life, what became possible, or how, at least as both of us as American citizens, how we've responded to Ukraine. Like the amount of money that we've now put into that war, that we aren't technically, I guess, involved in whatever ways that's supposed to mean, and all the other wars we don't spend money on. Like all this money showed up, but if you ask for half that for plenty of other things, oh, well, we can't do that. We can't do that. Oh, but we can find it for this. Or like we are able to flip switches and readjust the whole global economy and all sorts of things. And then we can turn it right back on once we get a chance. Like I can't decide if these are helpful things, like where I'm like, well, at least we have it in us to like to write a check or change things, or just like utterly depressing. That under what kind of data do you need to know we have a serious problem, and why would we not turn these switches for these type of reasons?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's, one way of reading the lockdowns is to say that, oh, all of this power that we didn't think we had to change the trajectory of society, oh, I guess it was there all along, and folks just chose not to use it. But we kind of know, we know that when it comes to, human loss of life, sometimes there's a real beautiful thing there of the ways that people are really courageously willing to step up and take forms of responsibility and think with science as well. But there's also like, I think there was a lot revealing in the pandemic, right? At the beginning, I wrote this piece about climate grief at the beginning of the pandemic. There was, as we were all under lockdown, all these sort of stories about, oh, the dolphins are returning to the lakes and bird song is louder than it's ever been. Like ecological habitats are coming back in. And there were a lot of news stories out there that were really debunking those sort of everyday senses, that actually the sighting of one lone dolphin is not ecological rewilding or rehabilitation. There's a bit of wishful thinking there, which says to me like that there's a desire for ecological kinds of civilization out there, because when they happen, people are really like awestruck by them. I think we're so numbed by our anthropocentrism that when we sort of have an encounter with what we deem as nature, we're kind of surprised by how profound it can be. And I want to honor that. I want to say something to the fact that, maybe we need to pay attention more to the way that our focus on human beings really numbs and dulls our senses of ecological context and perception. Politically, I think the pandemic is difficult because, of course, the impacts of the pandemic hit along intersectional lines of racial injustice and sexual injustice and ageism and all kinds of forms of injustice and vulnerability. And so that tells me that, we responded to the pandemic in a stopgap measure to reduce transmission, but we didn't respond to the societal vulnerabilities that made the tragedy of it and potentially the violence of it as awful as it was. We didn't respond to those. We didn't do anything, in fact. And we're reeling over a constant injustice, shooting, and all sorts of forms of and an attempted coup. So like in one sense, I want to say, oh yeah, there's measures that we have politically taken as a collective society to take something scientifically seriously. We did so in a really apolitical way, and in a way that wasn't as just as it could be. And that seems to resemble to me the way that a lot of responses to climate change and environmental issues and extinctions are going. There's a lot of green capitalism and greenwashing and saying, yeah, we care about the earth, we care about environmental things, but we're not going to consider it in an intersectional justice context. We're not going to actually do the radical overhauls of agricultural life that we need to, or put our energies and solidarities into forms of alleviating food deserts or conservation networks support that need to happen. So I guess to sum that all up, I think, maybe the complex process vision in that space is recognizing that there were multiple modes of relationality always happening all the way down. Like you're saying, you acknowledge what the reality on the ground is, that we see this certain strand of the impacts of the pandemic in real time. We're caring for, or attempting to care for the losses in those ways. We're not attending to other strands of relationality there that are contributing to the losses. And even with healthcare support, we're not doing all that we can in providing for that. So I don't want to read the radical societal change as a pure, like, glistening possibility. I think there's some of that there. I want to think about, like, how do we take the nuances of it seriously? Because, of course, also so many governments used the pandemic as a way to think about it as a security issue, to reinforce certain flows of immigration and senses of national identity and boundaries and political borders in ways that were problematic. And of course, they're doing that with climate as well. Like, climate change is a national security threat intensifier, or threat multiplier is the language being used. And frequently what they mean by that is that it's going to cause massive amounts of climate migration, and we don't want those folks where we live. There's no just ways of thinking about climate refugees, human and non-human, in those spaces. So there's a bit of nuanced analysis that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As an American who's a professor in Ireland, looking, across the ocean, what have you learned about America's challenges in the church within it because of the distance? Someone asked me a similar question the other day, and I didn't realize how many thoughts I had about it. But like when you've spent time outside of all the kind of norming assumptions of America and look back at us as a nation, and then the body of Christ within it, and such, like, what kind of things have become clear to you do you think would be important for people of faith to be taking seriously?
The one thing that I constantly think about, and I go back and forth on how I feel about it. And one of the questions that I get here when I say I teach theology is, are you religious? Right. And it's a discerning question. They want to know if I'm implicated in a certain kind of theocratic impulse that's been present in European societies and Irish societies, or that religion is a problem. And frequently it means very much a caricature of religion without much interrogation of it. So just as much as there's frequently about United States religion, this over focus on conservative fundamentalism and right-wing evangelicalism and Catholicism, the religious context of that is almost mirrored in a different way with a certain kind of secular caricature in Ireland, where for the evangelicals, they fear this sort of militant anti-religious secularism, and for the sort of secular post-Catholic Ireland, they fear this sort of anything religion. And that's an over caricature of the deep complexities of religious identity and influence on the island. But I'm struck that it seems to me that progressive religious folks in the US are less belabored in the sense that they believe that religious faith can do something or can have some sort of influence and an opportunity. And I frequently find in European contexts that voice is excluded, that you're either religious and out there or not and part of the political conversation here. So that is to say that sort of the certain kinds of progressive queer Christianity, in as much as there are local churches that are progressive in Ireland, what I've encountered so far is really it's the Unitarians and the Quakers who are the only ones willing to or have made it official to marry same-sex couples and do some of the progressive work. The rest of the quote unquote mainline churches, Catholic and Church of Ireland, don't quite do that yet here. And so there's a lot more progressive religious institutions in the US that I feel more comfortable around, I'd say. I'm also struck by I'm on an island and that island has a certain geophysical history and certain planetary history. That means there are not a lot of large animals on this island. There's not a lot of megafauna that I would have grown up with. And I noticed that lack of animality. And it's meant that I've had to reattune my senses of paying attention to my sense of place. And it happens for anyone who moves into a different ecological context or bioregion. I think you get used to and intimate with your own sense of place. But I notice it more here. I'm living in a city. My ecological encounters are like urban foxes late at night, pigeons, blue herons, and it's meant that I've had to pay attention differently to smaller kinds of critters than I'm normally used to. But that's part of an ecological education, I think. So the different kind of ecological education, and then trying to navigate the very different religious political lines in Ireland with its complicated histories. I'm, like one of a handful of Lutherans in Ireland. There's like a Lutheran church in Dublin that meets in German 3 weeks out of the month and then does hold an evening prayer, for those of you who know that, on Wednesdays once a month. So that's the English service. That's the English Lutheran service that I can go to, really.
Yeah, Ireland's not known for concentration of Lutherans.
No, it is known for a kind of global immigration and emigration. Mm-hmm. And I think that movement of it as an island is really interesting. It's also a place that is colonized, but also occupies a space of whiteness that's different in different global contexts. It's a place that has his sectarian histories, but then also is also working in really progressive ways, voted for same-sex marriage by popular vote, voted for abortion access by popular vote. So in very recent times, so in where a lot of countries have gone and turned into a sort of a political conservatism that frequently trades in ethno-nationalism and xenophobia and anti-queer. Ireland is a different case. It's gone the exact opposite way. It's become more of a progressive society over the course of it. And I think, there's something of a contextual hope that gives me for my own politics and sense of future, that you see change happening. But then it asks, the question is like, what is the place of religion in all of this? Does it just need to go away in this conversation? Does it need to look differently? Can it look differently given histories and attitudes towards religiosity, towards spirituality, ongoing discernment?
I think it's fascinating, like even in you saying that, how different it is just in Scotland, right? Like in America, the distance between Ireland and Scotland, it's like they could be in the same state. And here they're very unique cultures that I definitely didn't know it until I moved here. I was like, oh, and
yeah.
Also, there is also just like our neighbors, two of our neighbors, both taxi cab drivers, and they own a house, no school debt, and like I just like living here. There's some basic things that you go, how is this not a live option in America? And the UK is not good comparatively to the rest of the EU when it goes to social safety net and all that kind of stuff. But just in I feel like it's like someone that grew up Pentecostal and then they go to a liturgical church and like, this is really cool. I mean, the way they did the incense thing and the chanting, I didn't know when to stand up. And then after you get used to it, you're like, wow, the liturgical calendar, this is great. Going here and then like you're hanging around, you're like, I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for all my freedom and liberty to disappear. Like, you mean you don't live in the car you Uber in? Oh, well, there are those things as well.
Yeah.
The one thing we hadn't got to that I wanted to talk to you about is okay, let's do it as a vague question. Who is that dead person in the Christian tradition you think everyone should read more of, and why?
I'm trying to think of narrowing it down, because there's a handful that are really important to me. I will give you 3.
Well, I guess you can go Trinitarian.
So John Scotus Eriugena, 9th century Irish mystic. The Paraphysion.
That's who I was guessing you were going to pick.
That's one of them. I mean, I think the Paraphysion is one of the most remarkable Christian theological texts, and from a century that people kind of assume nothing's happening, from the 9th century. And it's this systematic, speculative treatise on the differences of creativity and divine presence in the universe as a theophanic reality. And I think it's incredible. And part of it, what I like it is because he was, posthumously declared a heretic and a pantheist. And I don't think he would have understood himself necessarily that way, but God's immanence, divine immanence in that world is really immanent in a way that I don't frequently see in sort of the dominant theological tradition. And that's really important to me. A second one I would say is Arthur McGill, and in particular, his little book, Death and Life in American Theology, where he talks about how Americans contextually make death into an idol by avoiding it. That by not talking about the vulnerabilities of life, by not talking about the ways in which our bodies age and decay or suffer, we sort of say death is over there. It's not us. We like to be young, have a certain image, immortal. And this is a certain critique of a certain kind of American context, of course. But in doing that, by not talking about death in life, you create this space that you render as holy and untouchable, that is death. And for someone who is more reformed than I am, I think that's a really powerful critique of contemporary evangelicalism and contemporary American Christianity that worships a kind of invulnerable power. And then I would say perhaps most recently then just is revisiting the works of Sally McFaig, I think is an important, a really important thing. And she, interestingly enough, and this is why I went for the 3, in her new or final posthumously published book, New Climate for Christology, she takes on McGill to sort of represent that particular conversation around death and vulnerability in her own context as she's thinking about these things and as she's thinking in an ecological way. So I give you the ancient one, which was the one you expected, and then this pair that are thinking across time together in a little different way.
Yeah. Well, no, that's great. And for those that haven't been a long time listener to the podcast, you should go listen to the 2 interviews with Sally McFay before she passed. They're great. And there's a YouTube video of the clip when at a live podcast of John Cobb and Sally talking to each other about, because they were both, John's 97, she was in her late 80s, like about death and thinking about it. And she gives this beautiful image of the Yule log. Anyway, everyone should just go check it out. Sally is pretty awesome. And it's a great recommendation. But so I've really enjoyed this. And what did I not ask about that? If people are doing process for the first time, getting to hang out with John Cobb, who I think demonstrates the potential of process thought for addressing a lot of ecological challenges and such, because, it wasn't another school of thought that we're putting out those books for years, So, but is there something I didn't ask or any kind of affirmation or provocation, right? For people thinking, many for the first time about process theology.
I feel like we need to reverse this at some day. I want to ask you a bunch of questions too at some point. I like hanging out with you, so that can happen. And I recently, interviewed Marion Grau, and she's like, "Can we have a 3-way podcast?" Oh yeah, that'd be great. That'd be very fun. Marion, my good comrade. Well, maybe let's say it like this way, like in terms of, we tend to talk about process theology in 2 very strong modes, in the philosophical mode, and then, at least for me, when I'm talking about it in ecological and queer spaces, in relationship to justice. And there's this like daily practice. You asked about the Bible, but there's this sense in which I think the contemplative and daily practice of process theology made Christian faith an alive practice for me again. I think in my own sense of spirituality, like I think I'd gotten very bored with prayer and wasn't sure if I was interested in it anymore. And Marjorie Suchocki has that book on prayer and the senses of paying attention to desire and letting the quiet of paying attention make different modes for prayer practice. I just think the personal spirituality dimension of it, the prayer dimension of it specifically, connected and made all these other pieces interestingly more resilient and sustainable for me. Like that sort of, because of the way that certain things like prayer and Christian practice are politicized in American culture, I don't like talking about them. And yet there's this reading sections of Whitehead really sort of has opened my mind in a little different way to sort of paying attention to these lived aspects of faith that I think, open me up, not to sort of believing in process thought in a dogmatic way, but to paying attention to the spirit and seeing where the adventure goes. And that's a really lovely gift to get back, that those things are meaningful again for me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, Jake, I like hanging out with you.
Yeah.
And if you're answering the questions, it's a lot easier. But but I am a bit intrigued as what would happen if you were asking the questions. See which way it would go. But that'll have to happen next time, because you and I get to go do this wonderful activity this afternoon.
Yes.
Marking essays,
end of term.
Woo!
Talk about a spiritual discipline.
Yes. Penance is. I hope that at least half the ones you have left say the word ontological argument in the opening paragraph. That way it just works out well. It works out well. And how many times in when you're marking, do you highlight the masculine pronouns for God and just go, why?
Yeah.
I got more creative over time here. The giving of a phallus to the divine in the UK context than at least in mainline Protestant context in America. They swing those D's around like champs here. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah. The traditionalist language pops up. I've gotten in the habit of, I don't know, because a lot of grading happens online now, but I've always graded with a huge sheet of stickers along the way and a bunch of multicolored pens. So I feel like when I give back papers to students in a physical form, they look like a Lisa Frank doodle, like that bright neon dolphins and stuff. my inner creative self comes out, and anything to keep it light and helpful. I will say I've got some great students. And my papers likely won't have ontological in them because my last batch are mostly on animal ethics and theology. So we've got a lot more interesting things there.
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's always good. It's always good. But yeah. Anyway, it's been a blast, and I'll look forward to the next time we get to connect.